Bien, buenos días a todas. Soy Marisol Salanova, crítica de arte y socia de ForoMAV. Simplemente subo aquí para dar paso a la visualización del encuentro con Frances Morris, directora de la Tate Modern desde 2016, primera mujer directora de una institución de arte en Reino Unido, y que me ha pedido que la disculpe por no poder asistir, que en principio iba a estar aquí acompañándonos a todas, pero por las circunstancias excepcionales en Reino Unido y motivos profesionales también no ha podido venir. Entonces me comentaba pues eso, que trasladara un poco ese calor de acompañamiento, que le gustaría estar aquí con nosotras. A mí me gustaría agradecer a la coordinación técnica, a Marta Pérez Soria y a Jesús Orrico también, y al equipo tan rápido de subtítulos, Claudia Caballero, que han tenido la amabilidad de trabajar en cuestión de horas para que ejecutásemos la entrevista, el encuentro online y pudiéramos tenerlo traducido para poder pasarlo aquí ya con los subtítulos y ya con una pequeña edición que tenga buena calidad suficiente para que lo sigamos. Es la herramienta ForoMAV por la igualdad en los museos y centros de arte que nuestra presidenta Lola le pasó tiempo atrás con su traducción al inglés y que ella ha estado leyendo con atención, y entonces, por lo tanto, comentamos algunos aspectos y ponemos en común valores que son compartidos de su gestión y de lo que es toda la estructura de pensamiento y de acción de la asociación de ForoMAV, ¿no? Y que felizmente pues esto tiene lugar en esta institución, como es el Centre del Carme, Consorci de Museus de la Comunitat Valenciana lo coordina, lo coorganiza, y es una institución que precisamente es paradigmática en cuanto también transparencia, buenas prácticas y igualdad. Entonces, bueno, pues me parece adecuadísimo que nos hayamos reunido aquí para esto, el contexto, la compañía y el honor de que en unas circunstancias bastante complicadas pues nos haya atendido Frances Morris. Os dejo con ella. Gracias.
An interview with Frances Morris. According to the Theoretical and Methodological Foundation for the Self-Diagnosis Project for Gender Equality in Museums and Art Centers by Associations ForoMAV, Mujeres en las Artes Visuales, Women in the Visual Arts, there is an evident underrepresentation of women as producers of culture in Spain. The ForoMAV self-diagnosis tool and the conceptual foundations can be applied in different national and international contexts. The aim is to create professional museum practices to create a democratic culture based on equality from an intersectional gender perspective. So we need to work together because the map really could be redrawn in many ways. Yep. Ms. Morris, thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to meet with us today.
It's a pleasure to join you for such an important conversation, and it's great that this is taking place in Spain.
Great, thank you. You have over 30 years experience, curatorial and managerial, within the public sector in UK. Would you say that there was a time when conditions for women and their situation, our situation in the arts, really changed?
It's such a good question. It's so difficult to give a straightforward answer because, of course, from the vantage point of today in 2021, when I look back over 30 years, of course, many things have changed. But I think what is difficult is to pinpoint a moment of significant shift, because what I think have been witness to is a very, very slow and incremental shift in both the nature of the institution and the way we approach gender. But of course, we are talking about my career of 30 years against, many centuries of patriarchy. Mm-hmm. And patriarchy, which not only suffuses the museum and the practice of art, but of course is embedded societally and embedded very differently depending on where you are in the world. And therefore, while I'm quite upbeat and in a way proud with what we've been able to achieve within Tate Modern, I realise that across the sector as a whole, those achievements are are not necessarily the norm. And many other organisations are facing far greater challenges than what I face at Tate Modern. So to give you an example, I think, of course, Tate Modern occupies in a way a pioneering position in the Western world of modern and contemporary art museums. And we are surrounded by a kind of a private sector. But within our private sector, I think it's 78% of galleries still have a predominant representation of men. So already within our own little bubble of the contemporary art world, there is a huge disparity. And those disparities are then replicated across the sector and beyond. So I can't see a moment of paradigm shift because I don't think there has been one. But I think there has been incremental progress, organic progress.
Mm-hmm. And nowadays, Tate's international collection is a good example of an equal collection. It is not just a matter of numbers, of course. Please tell us about the challenges you're facing. How did you achieve that goal?
Well, okay, that's, again, I think it's this has been a very long struggle, a very long project. And for me personally, it was one that I was aware that was necessary to address in the earliest days of my career in the 1980s. One of the first artist studios that I ever visited was the feminist photographer, sculptor, performance artist Helen Chadwick, who very tragically died in her late 40s. But what I found remarkable about Helen's work was that she illustrated the need for female artists to repossess the body of art history. She literally imprinted her body on the kind of formalistic language of minimalism, and she did it in a brilliant and funny and captivating way. And that need to not just give profile to the work of overlooked female artists, but to allow their agency to help us to rewrite art history itself, I think has been something that I always felt was profoundly important. So it wasn't just a question of numbers, of bringing in an equal number of female artists, but it was also a question of working through the agency of those artists to challenge the institution itself. And as I said earlier, the art institutions or museums, many institutions across society, date back to, in the UK, to the 18th century. And so they hold within them, and deeply hold within them, values that were created and behaved by a male-dominated society. And those values then sit within the the development of art history. And it is those values that we now need to challenge, not just the ownership of them by men. And so alongside the privileging of the work of women, we've also need to look at the male privilege within art history. So, for example, it is interesting that the canon, certainly as expressed in Tate's collection, is principally a canon within painting and a particular type of sculpture, and that in my collection, until this century, we did not acquire works of art that sat outside painting or sculpture. So one of the really important roles that we have undertaken during this last 20 years is we've begun to explore art history outside the boundaries of the canon, because those boundaries have been defined by a kind of patriarchal history. So that has helped us understand that if we truly going to open up the collection to a notion of gender and racial and social equality, we need to look at art outside the Western canon. We need to look at practices outside the hegemony of painting and sculpture. We need to look at live art and performance. We need to look at all the kind of institutional structures and boundaries that have created the kind of hegemonic position for male artists.
In order to make this goal reality in other museums, any advice?
Well, I think, yes, I think I do have some advice. I think that is the key thing, is not just to think that it's a numbers game, but that actually it's about changing the perception of all institutions. We have a kind of default male when we think about art. Mm-hmm. The marketplace is default male. So whenever my colleagues talk about the need to make successful exhibitions, to create memberships, to sell product in the shop, the default is always to famous male artists. That if you have a Warhol on a T-shirt, you will sell more T-shirts than a Louise Bourgeois. Now, the only way we counter that default is by continuously recalibrating what we do. It's a little bit like sailing a boat with the wind against the tide. You have to continuously compensate for the tide. So it is, for me, it's a question of being meticulous in making sure that your commitment to gender equality shines through everything that you do. When you put out a newsletter about your program, you must make sure that the images speak to that. When you do your public messaging in your press release, you must make sure that you always present an equal and balanced account. It is, and in order that when your bookshop makes its postcard selection, those postcards, so everything that you do must speak across that behavior. I think the other thing to say is that it is just, for me, it's a question of continuous vigilance, and not just vigilance, but being really super creative. Don't take no for an answer. You can always find ways of making great projects with women that will drive large audiences. But it is a question of, the lazy answer is to default to a well-known male artist.
But the market is about that. So, male artists are dominating the market. Well, so maybe your program is against the market, or
why should we feel that the public sector needs to be in line with the marketplace? And I think that one of the really worrying symptoms within the art world over the last 20 years is that as public funds and governmental and civic support for the artists has begun to erode, that museums and galleries have looked to the private sector, the commercial sector, to fill that gap. And this is a real problem because, of course, the neoliberal world of the commercial sector is all about making money, and that is the driver. And so museums have to be really, really intelligent in how they work with the private sector. And what we all need is a strong ethical code that is written into our governance and supported by our trustees, and then a very, very strong moral compass, so that you don't take the easy option, which is this check signed by the commercial gallery. Because there is a danger, and I see this happening in galleries, not just in the UK, across the world, that where we will just become the shop fronts for dealers and auction houses. And we absolutely have to guard against this. But it's, you know, what is really interesting is that when I look at the projects that we have done at Tate Modern over the last 2 years, the projects that I feel really proud of are not the projects that have cost hundreds of thousands of pounds, but there many of them are the projects where we have hosted an artist, or we've created something from a very small budget, but that has been so highly visible, like the Jenny Holzer projection on front of Tate Modern just 2 weeks ago. Inspirational, powerful, with a global reach. So we need to have the conviction of the value of art itself and the value of great art by women, which is a different kind of value to the monetary value that the market speaks of.
Very interesting.
We need the power of our conviction. I mean, let me give you an example that 3 or 4 years ago, we worked with Tania Bruguera, the Cuban feminist activist artist, on our Hyundai turbine hall commission. One of the things that Tania did is she worked with a group of local activists. And the first time we've actively worked with an activist organization within the museum. And the legacy of that project was that we named our huge boiler house, the huge power station of Tate Modern, we named it officially after a local social worker called Natalie Bell. And this was this came about because the group of activists and Tania Bruguera asked me to take the name of the philanthropists and wealthy people who'd named our galleries as an act. She wanted us to take those names away in a critique of the commercial world, a critique of capitalism, if you like. Of course, we could not do that. But as a result, we offered to name a whole building after somebody that she and her co-workers amongst our activist neighbours wanted to celebrate. And this was a project that the naming cost us absolutely nothing, but it was the most unbelievably powerful gesture to have one building named in honour of the great philanthropist Len Blavatnik, who lent his money for our institution, and another building named after this powerful but local neighbourly social worker. So, you know, it's different registers of value. We need to be very sophisticated in how we think about value.
Taking care of the local and making community, that's the point, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So which is the best way to support female artists and women in visual arts?
Well, I think the best way is to listen and learn and respond. And I sometimes think that if we allowed women artists to shape the museum, we would have a very different kind of museum. And many of my learnings have come from supporting female artists and working with them and actually enabling them to tell me what to do. About 10 years ago, a wonderful British-American artist called Susan Hiller, really a pioneer of the feminist, a feminist activist, took me to lunch and said, Frances, you need to work differently with artists. Mm-hmm. And she told me that the Tate needed to create a membership scheme for all the artists in its collection, so that Tate would be a place that was their place. And I listened very carefully, and I went away and I talked with my colleague, Anne Gallagher, and a month later, we invited all our artists to become Tate artists with the same rights and privileges that all our members have. And it transformed the relationship of Tate and our local community of artists. So the way we can support artists is actually respect them and listen to them. 2 years ago, a group of artists, many of them female, the majority of them feminist activist artists, came to me and asked us as an institution to declare climate emergency. And we sat around a table overlooking the City of London, St. Paul's, and I had no real power to take that decision on behalf of Tate, because of course I have a director and we have trustees, but they asked me and I said we would do it. I said we would do it, fingers crossed, but then I took responsibility for talking with my director and our trustees, and we declared climate emergency. So in my view, the most important thing I can do is be a sounding board, a receptive witness, and to then take actions on behalf of this community.
Because there are a lot of places where the women artists, they don't feel like heard, and you listen them, and you are like very, I don't know how to do it, like there is not so much distance like with other institutions.
I mean, I think we live in the age of activist artists and collectives, and institutions are increasingly performing as activist institutions. I think the key thing when an institution invites activist artists to work with them is that they have to be willingly receptive. Mm-hmm. So, museums host exhibitions, they commission artists, they make exhibitions, but I see very little point in doing that unless the institution itself is willing and able and actually has an appetite to go on a journey with that artist. And one of the things that I've felt very gratified, or not gratified, that's been very important to me, is that every single exhibition and project that we have undertaken at Tate Modern with a female artist, alive or dead, has been an opportunity for institutional learning, mm-hmm. sometimes for institutional apology or acknowledgement, but they've always been active relationships. So one of the things that we've been doing over the last 10 years, as I said, we've been opening up the collection. And we've been opening up the collection, I suppose, it kind of towards a more ecological approach to art history, where art history is not bounded by territories that confine it, but actually that works across boundaries. So across boundaries, for example, of geography. So we're thinking much more about a kind of the international connections between artists, sort of like an international ecosystem where artists talk to each other or message each other, or so that an artist in Asia will, of course, be part of the trajectory of arts practiced in Eastern Europe. We know this happens. Art history has been confined to national histories for too long. But there are also boundaries between media practices. Mm-hmm. So, one of the privileges has been to do a series of exhibitions looking at the early years of modernism. We think about modernism for so many decades interpreted according to a kind of formal language and with an aesthetic set of judgments. But of course, many of the great female artists of the early part of the 20th century, and I'm thinking of people like Natalia Goncharova or Annie Albers or Sophie Taube-Arp, whose exhibition has just finished here, were artists who completely defied that kind of sense of boundary, that they worked in theatre and design, architecture, they made paintings, they were choreographers, they designed costumes or stained glass. And, how incredible to use those artists, make exhibitions of their work, both to help expand people's horizons of what constitutes visual culture, but also to begin to unpick our own sense of art history within the institution. So I think those sort of pre or proto-feminist artists, although, they weren't setting themselves up as activists, they were, by their behaviours and their own careers, creating a counter-narrative to the kind of canonical sense of art history that we know it. And pretty good idea that were they living their lives again to now, they would be on the, they'd be on the forefront of feminist activism. And so I love that idea that we can generate a kind of sense of solidarity and communality across a long history, a long duration. So that, we're this week installing Lubena Himid's retrospective, which will open in 10 days' time. And when I walk through the galleries, as I walked through this morning, the same galleries that we had Sophie Taube-Arp's exhibition, and I just thought, this is incredible, 100 years separate these two great women, but they are both banging away against the boundaries that have limited their the appreciation of them. And it's nice to open up their practices, I think, to a wider audience.
And how can art institutions navigate this age of mixed economy, private and public? As you were talking about art galleries too, still maintaining their ethical positions like commitment to equality and gender justice? Yeah.
Well, I think we lead the way and the market will follow. I think it's interesting that in this time of kind of societal crisis, climate emergency, ecological crisis, I think that museums have a really powerful role in helping us reshape how we work with each other, how we work with culture, the place of culture. And I think that more expansive civic role that museums can have is something that the private sector is going to have to think very carefully about how they recalibrate their sense of purpose and worth going forwards. And I think that's a very exciting moment that we might, think we work with the private sector a little bit like a concertina. Mm-hmm. I think in the kind of great, neoliberal pre-2008 decade, there was real synergies between, it was a growth model. Everybody was getting richer and more successful, and budgets were growing, and the champagne was flowing. I think we're now at a moment in time where we are revaluing the point of culture. And I think that revaluation is also taking place in the private sector. And I certainly hope so. So I think, I think there are a number of different models that I think we could be moving towards, where the private sector might be able to support the public sector in a more distributed fashion. So supporting the sector rather than supporting the marketplace through the sector. And those are conversations that we're beginning to have with across the business of the art world.
I think so. You worked hard to have many opportunities to develop your personal and professional skills through your career. As we know, you are passionate about public space. If we believe in power of public art and its ability to turn artistic practice into social action, can feminist interventions disrupt and change museum practices?
I think they can, but I don't think they can do it on their own. I mean, I think it's interesting that, for many years, museums describe themselves as places of debate and contestation. Actually, I think museums are places for discussion and collaboration, and therefore, and diplomacy. And I think, therefore, that we need to be willing receptors, and we need to invite activists into our organization and welcome them and work with them. And I think, being an activist artist doesn't mean to say you're particularly tough or thick-skinned. It means you feel very passionately about something. And I have noticed how amongst the activist artists that I've worked with, how many are actually very vulnerable. And I think it's incredibly important that big institutions work with activists in a really careful, supportive way, and don't set artists up for a fall, and don't expose them to the very, very challenging social media angry space that there is outside. And I think we can easily get our fingers burnt if we think artists can do our job for us. They can tell us what to do, they can urge us what to do, but we have to take responsibility for it. So I suppose, I mentioned Tanya Bagheera, but I've had great pleasure, to work with wonderful female activists, from the Guerrilla Girls to Suzanne Lacey, to Anne Imhoff, Annika Yee. I mean, really articulate, powerful women, but none of them could be as powerful and as effective as they have been without the 100% support of the institution and all the people within it. So it really is a collaboration. It's not a conflict. It has to be a mutually supportive environment.
Do you think that social media and all that kind of relations on the internet are a new public space for museums and for artists?
I think I'm not sure what I think. I know that it's a space that's very it's very difficult to regulate. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult, and one is very exposed within it. And I've seen the huge damage that can be done to individuals who are become the subject of controversy. It can be a very hurtful space. So I think we need to be extremely careful with the kind of social media space. Yeah.
It offers a lot of opportunities, but it could be very, very dangerous. I see.
Yeah, and obviously it is the future. So we can't shy away from it, but I would not ever think that one can control it.
Mm-hmm. So, Ms. Morris, thank you very much for this interview, for give us your time, and I hope to see you soon again.
Well, thank you for your really interesting and quite difficult questions.
Thanks.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye.